Hello and welcome to the Being Formed podcast. My name is Adam. I'm the host of the show. Today's conversation touches on something many people carry, but often struggle to name and to navigate. We're talking about trauma. Not only the kinds of trauma that come from catastrophic events, but the slower wounds that form over time in relationships, in families, even within our experiences of church and faith. So over the years in spiritual direction, I've sat with many people who deeply love God, and yet they find themselves stuck, anxious, numb, or disconnected in ways they don't fully understand. They pray, they read scripture, they try to trust God, and yet something inside still feels unsettled. More and more, we're learning that trauma leaves an imprint not only on our memories, but in our bodies, our nervous systems, even in the way we experience God. That's why I'm grateful for today's guest, Dr. Dave Janvier. Dave is a licensed professional counselor, a certified clinical trauma professional, sex therapist, and spiritual director. He's also the founder of Simda Soul Care, a ministry that brings together trauma, therapy, neuroscience, and spiritual direction, all to help people experience deeper healing and integration in their lives with God. In this conversation, Dave helps us explore what it really means to be trauma-informed, not as a buzzword, but as a posture of care. We talk about how trauma shapes the spiritual life, why safety and consent matter deeply in soul care, and how spiritual direction can become a place where people are gently accompanied toward healing. So if you've ever wondered why certain struggles persist, if you've ever felt a tension between faith and this unresolved pain, or if you simply want to learn how to care for others with greater wisdom and compassion, I think you'll find this conversation both grounding and hopeful. So let's slow down together and listen. Here's my conversation with Dr. Dave Janvier. Well, hello, Dr. Dave Janvier. Welcome to the Being Formed podcast. I'm so glad you're here to be with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm glad to be here as well.
Oh, man. We met just about a month ago. I'll date this podcast. This is end of February 2026, where we're recording. And you and I had a chance to meet for the first time 1 month ago in sunny, warm Phoenix, Arizona for the CSDA gathering, the annual gathering. It was your first time there. And I just enjoyed meeting you so much and engaging with you, hearing your heart, hearing what you are passionate about, more about your ministry. And so I was eager to bring you here onto the podcast. I'm so glad you said yes, and it's worked out for us to be together.
Yeah, I'm also glad for that and just honored to be invited.
Oh, man, thank you. Well, I warned you in advance that the first question I was going to ask is my favorite question, really, and I think it's becoming our audience's favorite question as well. They're used to it now. It's a relational question. It's designed to ground us together here, Dave, on common ground. The question is just how, not so much how are you, but how is it with your
Mhm.
soul today?
Yes, yes. No, I appreciate that question, and sometimes it's hard to really answer that. But I think in an honest way, I think my soul has been intention
Intention.
and intention. Yeah. So on the one hand, I sit and I witness God's power of healing in people's lives. But on the other hand, I sit with a lot of deep hurt and suffering. And but in many respects, how God's people has perpetrated the hurt and the pain and the
Mm,
suffering.
mm, mm. Boy, I hear that. I feel that. Mm. Well, that just opens us up, man, to I think maybe where we're heading in this conversation. To begin, I think it'd be really helpful for us to hear your story. How do you find yourself doing the work you do now? I'm curious. I'm sure our listeners will be curious to make some connections here. How did your vocational path move, from where you began, maybe vocationally as a counselor to a founder of a ministry and a spiritual director, and all the things that come together to make you you. I'm curious, just some of your story, if you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, I've had some people call me a unicorn because I've had all these different various aspects that normally don't go together, but I've integrated. Um, but yeah, so some of my own story is about the journey that God has invited me on to go deeper with God's self, but also with deeper healing and deeper relationship with God. And it's been a journey of healing from my own history of abuse and sexual trauma, and so even God's presence back in my earlier life with hurts, wounds, pains, traumas. God was already working. I may not have been aware of it at the time, but I've always had an awareness of God. I grew up in the church, and but through a journey of invitation to work on my own healing, it is how I got into the counseling field. And I've always saw my role in learning and being trained as a therapist as missional. And I was just kind of fascinated by God's own work in my own life and wanting to bring that to other people. And then doing this kind of work and working with people in these deep ways and seeing how God shows up and frees people, kind of expanded sort of my heart and role where, I longed for that for everybody, not just those coming to me for pain and for healing, but how can we invite people to this deep experience, this felt sense, tangible presence of God in their lives? And so that's how I, generally got to this place of integrating spiritual formation with clinical practice and other healing modalities.
Hmm. Wow. Would you tell us a little bit about your ministry, what it's called, kind of what that focus is?
Yeah, so it's an acronym and it's SIMDA, Soul Care, and SIMDA is spelled SIIMDA. And I know it's a mouthful, but it really stands for spiritually informed, integral, multidimensional approach. And
Okay.
each of those aspects have meaning about how the approach works and operates and is integrated.
Hmm.
And so spiritually informed is really rooted in some basic Christian theology, but more so in the Trinitarian relationship and with Jesus's healing ministry and contemplative practices and ways of being in presence and all of that. So spiritually informed stands for that. So the S and the I, and then the second I stands for integral. And so integral is really trying to encompass all aspects of who we are integral to who we are as a whole.
Hmm.
So the physical, the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual, the sexual parts of self, the relational, the communal is all integral to who we are and holistically being embodied. And so I think oftentimes spirituality has been bifurcated from the body and has done harm. And so the integral part is how we're all integrated in all aspects of parts and self.
Hmm.
And so multidimensional really just stands for the many aspects that I have integrated into the approach. And so I'm trained in Gestalt theory and practice. And so the undergirding of it is Gestalt theory and practice, but also internal family systems
Hmm.
theory, interpersonal neurobiology, sensory motor psychotherapy, Hakomi therapy, body and experiential work, and so there's a lot of things that I pull into and kind of borrow from to integrate it so that it's a holistic healing approach. Um, and that gets to the next one, which is approach. And basic definition of approach is drawing near to. And I take that as meaning drawing near to ourselves, drawing near to God, drawing near to others, and it more encompasses the whole notion of presence, presence with myself and presence with others. And then what undergirds the whole theory is how is it that as we're formed and shaped into the likeness of Christ, but also in discernment of the Holy Spirit's empowerment of the work. And so it's not me just picking tools out of my toolkit, but how does the Holy Spirit inform which one I am using in the moment with what's happening in me and what's happening in the person that I'm working with or the client or the directee.
Hmm.
And so it has to be foundational in terms of that discernment piece.
Practically, when it all comes down to sitting in front of folks, sitting with folks, um, or doing some of the trainings and the webinars and the cohorts and things that your ministry does, which we will talk about. What what role does you already mentioned the word trauma at one point? What role does like being trauma informed play into some of your work? And
Yeah, it's a that's a foundational piece of how I work and looking through a trauma lens.
okay,
And it might be helpful to kind of define trauma
yes,
initially here, because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around it. And I think when people, say trauma, a lot of people go to this place of like pathology or then I have a mental illness.
hmm,
And I think trauma can be paired in with those kinds of things. But if I were to boil down what trauma really is, in a simple definition, is something happened or a series of events happened that overwhelmed my system and able to handle.
hmm,
And so it has impacted my brain, my body, my nervous state system in ways that I am unable to cope.
hmm,
In which, in many ways, I believe that God created our brains and our bodies as a means of grace to be able to handle hard things and
hmm,
traumatic things in the way that trauma symptoms appear in terms of like dissociation, where we kind of disconnect from reality or our bodies or our feelings for a period of time, which we at some places that can be pathological when it's not healthy, but in many ways I see it as a means of grace on how God allowed me to survive a tragic or horrific event.
hmm,
And so I kind of look at trauma, and there's some more expanded meanings of that because we can have one event traumas like being
hmm,
in a car accident, or we can have what's called complex developmental traumas, where if I grew up in a family
hmm,
and there was consistent abuse over time.
hmm. Can you say more about that? When you talk about consistent abuse over time, like what are the various ways of thinking about this developmental aspect?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and important to differentiate. Whereas, there's your main abuses like sexual abuse, physical
Okay.
abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, where there's, explicit harm done, those kinds of things. But then, if we think about what also can be traumatic, is being raised in a home to where I'm not being physically beaten, I'm not being sexually abused,
Right.
um, but there could be some subtle emotional things happening over time or psychological things that accumulate to an impact of a trauma event on the brain and the body and the nervous state system.
Hmm.
So, for instance, if I'm growing up in a family and I was never allowed to have any needs, or I
Hmm.
wasn't allowed to give expression to my emotions.
Hmm.
And so, developmentally, as a kid, then I cut off parts or I shut down. And then that impairs the way that developmentally my brain is growing
Hmm.
and that I learned how to cope or I learned how to get needs met in legitimate ways. And in turn, that can have symptoms as like a traumatic event.
Yeah.
And so if you can kind of chart out, like an XY axis line graph here, whereas on the bottom, you have frequency and on the top is intensity. And so if we have a one event trauma that has high intensity, then you can have a traumatic impact.
Hmm.
Or if over time on the bottom, there's a lot of these little frequencies, but then it happens over time is that the intensity increases over time to where the same kind of impact can happen on the brain and the body and have trauma symptoms.
Okay. That. It's very helpful. Thank you. Um, Recently, we heard some of the same language when we were at this gathering together. I found it very interesting that the language of a relational home came up.
Hmm.
Did you have, who was your relational home, right? And almost this kind of like correlation between if you didn't, if you can't identify that, if you didn't have that, then you well, let's say, first of all, if you did, you kind of moved into this place of like resiliency or something like that. Whereas if you
Hmm.
could, if you didn't, there was this kind of, like you were saying, this frequency of kind of
Hmm.
things that would lead to this kind of sense of trauma in a way. Can you speak into that at all?
Yeah, yeah. So I did like that concept of this relational home, because our brains and our bodies and how we're created in God's image is because we are relational beings.
Hmm.
Our brains are relational organs, right? Even from the earlier moments of birth, our brains are forming and shaping in terms of relationship and bonding and attachment. And so what happens is when we don't have healthy, secure attachment processes, whereas like abuse or subtle things over time can rupture the way that we relate. So if you
Hmm.
can think about just developmentally in a healthy way, if one of our children are fearful or afraid and they run to their primary caregiver and we give comfort and soothing and care, but when that's not available, then our bodies have to react in a way of how we're going to survive. And so, what we're looking at then is relationship is important for healing because then I can have my nervous state system in a way to feel safe.
Hmm.
Because what happens with trauma is that my brain and body are no longer detecting that I'm safe.
Hmm. Hmm. So, so enter in this concept of rebuilding or building a sense of a relational home, right?
Hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that like this sense of like a deep spiritual deepening that gets to this, it gets all the way into the body, right?
Yeah, yeah, because when we think about when we have trauma, it interferes with how we can do relationship.
Okay.
If you think about an ultimate impact of trauma is that our brains and our nervous state systems can't detect safety.
Okay.
When we're in that kind of brain state, we can't do relationship.
Okay.
And that's relationship with ourselves, with other people, and with God.
Hmm.
And so when we are in relationship with someone that's cultivating a safe space and inviting that kind of work with someone where we can help to retrain their brain and recondition their nervous state system by having presence, by
Hmm.
being safe, by giving agency and choice, by allowing them just to be where they are and being seen and being loved and accepted in that present moment, does a lot to heal the brain and the body and the nervous
Hmm.
state system.
Hmm. I see this very horizontal and I see it very vertical as well. What happens? What needs to happen first?
Yes. Yeah. So what needs to happen first is, I think, for people to become trauma informed,
Mm,
and like what to look for. And I think, and maybe how that can look in spiritual direction is, oftentimes I think a lot of spiritual directors are trained in, where is God in this person's life? And, how can they grow in faith? Or what meaning or can we have in deeper experience of God? Um, versus now, as I'm trauma informed, how has this person been shaped by trauma?
mhm,
And how can we engage God in ways that restore safety
mhm,
and agency and integration rather
mhm,
than reenact harm? And so, because oftentimes, and especially those I worked with, have been spiritually abused in the church, a lot of church language, a lot of scripture language, a lot of authority, submission, those kinds of things can all be triggers to the nervous state
mm,
system.
mm,
But if we're looking through more of a trauma informed lens, then it actively explores how trauma shapes that directee's image of God and their
Mm,
experience of religious language.
mm,
And so it is recognizing also that God may be experienced as unsafe or demanding or
mhm,
absent or controlling. And so it's the invitation of inviting the directee to have those kinds of experiences of God and that it's
mm,
safe in doing so. And then
mm,
as we're present with them and inviting those things, and then they're having a sense that it's okay just to
mhm,
be here and to have these experiences and these feelings. I'm not being judged or condemned by that. And then
mhm,
that's integrating for the brain.
mm,
And it's
mm,
also allowing them to be seen. And so, coming from more of what's happening in the brain with this, one of my go-to persons on neurobiology, interpersonal neurobiology, is Dan Siegel.
mm,
And he says being seen gives a feeling of being real,
mm,
of being connected, of not being alone. When we are safe and seen, when we have the sense of feeling felt and being psychologically held in mind by another, we develop a sense of inner security. And that's what we're attempting to do as we're trauma informed spiritual directors or
mm.
clinicians, is allowing that person to have that sense of being safe, being seen, and doing the integration within their brain and their body and their nervous state system.
Can you unpack a little more of what this might look like in practice in a spiritual direction session? How are we helping create that safety and help that directee feel seen?
Yeah, what I find with a lot of trauma survivors is a big part that comes up is shame.
Okay,
And so, and you're probably aware how shame shows up a lot.
I am.
And so I think in a session, how that could look if a person is experiencing shame or if they're mentioning it, sometimes they may not come out and mention it at first, but there's some bodily telltale signs that, if they can't make eye contact, if they're always
Hmm.
looking down, if their shoulders are more rolled forward.
Hmm.
And these are just some things I picked up over time that I find that is connected to the body and with shame. And also being spiritually, trauma informed as a spiritual director, it's helpful to know what the symptoms or the signs are and how a person holds themselves in their body.
Hmm.
And so a lot of it is sort of tracking. And so, we
Hmm.
usually listen about what is the spirit doing, but we want to integrate that, but also what is the body telling me? And so the body is constantly stating and telling wordless storytelling.
Oh.
And so we can pick up a lot up about what the body is doing as part of our discernment. So getting back to shame is if shame is present, then I may just ask the directee, okay, so um, would you be willing to allow your shame just to be present here in the room? How are you noticing shame in your body right now? And then they may say, I'm feeling like this constriction in my chest or a queasy feeling in my stomach. Okay, so would you be willing just to stay with that for a moment and just notice? And then I also, and before I do this, I'm also very well of grounding techniques. So I may ask them, would you be willing just to take a breath?
Hmm.
Because breathing helps to stay grounded in the person's body and nervous state system. And so I may ask them to do that. Um, and then also, I may then invite them to imagine that, let's say that shame is being extracted from your body and it's showing up in the room somewhere. Where and how does shame show up for you? Where is shame showing up here now in the room for you? And so then they have this experience of, it feels really different that I'm imagining that shame is not in me and that
Oh.
it's separate. And so now I'm having this experience in my body that I don't feel shame. What's it like not to feel shame right now? And so that's what we want to imprint on the nervous state system. We don't want to reinforce the imprinting of how shame feels in the body. Now here's this new experience. And then I may then also ask, okay, so, what's it like? Because what we know about shame is it makes us want to hide and we don't want to be seen. And so I may then ask, so would you be willing to notice that your shame is present and you're present and I'm seeing you?
Mm.
What's it like that I'm seeing you and your shame? And, some may report, that's kind of hard, because, shame is the one feeling that we feel shame for feeling shame.
Yeah.
And and so then I take some moments here to allow them to notice your shame's present, you're present, and you're being seen, and you're not being hurt, you're not being condemned, you're not being rejected, you're not being made fun of. And then after an experience of that, then shame usually dissipates. Or I may then ask them, um, hmm, I'm curious, if your shame had its own voice and could speak, what would he or she say, depending upon their gender? What would your shame say? And then some folks, would express, shame would say that I'm not worthy, or, those kinds of things, or I've done something wrong, or I can't be forgiven, or I can't be loved, or, some of those kinds of things. And then I may like shift it a little bit and have them get a sense of, okay, so I'm curious, as you stay with your shame, what do you sense that your shame needs? And then maybe they may express that shame may need to know that I'm loved, or that I am accepted, or I can be forgiven, those kinds of things. And then I may say, well, I wonder who you may need that from. And they may say some people, but then they also may get the God because I don't feel that from God.
Mhm.
Okay, so now would you be willing? And before I do this intervention, I'm always cautious about making sure I've worked with the person ahead of time about their God image, because then this could be
Mhm.
triggering and re traumatizing. But if I'm working with this person, and this next intervention would be if I worked with them with their God image and I feel secure in that, and they do too, is then I'll say, okay, so let's just notice that you're present, your shame is present. And would you be willing to notice God's presence right now? How is God showing up for you here and now? And they may say, they could say, well, God's, here, um, he's standing next to me, or he's sitting in the chair across from me, or he's somewhere in the room, or some people don't see the image, but I feel like he's standing behind me and his hands are on my shoulder, and they
Mhm.
have a felt sense of that. Or they may have an image of Jesus there. And then once they have their image and really feeling God's presence in the moment, how God may be showing up in that moment, then I may ask them, okay, so would you be willing to notice how God is seeing you right now? And also, would you be willing to notice how is God responding to your shame or seeing your shame? And then oftentimes they have a sense of, you know, hmm, this makes me emotional because I've sat with that a lot. And so I have
Mhm.
pictures of clients around that, but they may say, you know, God's not rejecting me, or God really loves me. And I have a felt sense of that, or I'm feeling forgiven. And I'm noticing that my shame is diminishing right now. Okay, so let's take a moment and kind of notice how that feels in your body, because we need that to imprint on
Mhm.
the nervous state system, because the nervous state system has been conditioned for the trauma.
Mhm.
And then this is how we change the body. And this is how we're changing the very cellular level of the brain and changing new neural pathways in the brain away from those things. And so the more that we can offer those kinds of re experiencing spaces, but it has to include the body.
Mhm. Thank you for that wonderful, detailed, practical explanation. So good. I want to rewind all the way back to the beginning of this conversation around shame, would you would you as the director in that space call out shame, or would you only go on this path if they identified it?
Hmm. Yeah, so if I'm noticing like some of those body signals, then I would just ask, I'm really curious about what you're noticing in your body right now.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because then what if we call out something in someone, so it's kind of like, I do this in marital therapy all the time where like one spouse is saying, "Don't tell me how I'm feeling." And so, but when we say that and we're calling and we're I'm not labeling, but we're bringing an awareness to their shame that can
Mhm.
heighten their sense of it. And so trauma is all about not having voice and not having choice.
Say that
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. Trauma is not having voice and choice.
Okay.
And so if we're trauma informed, we always want to allow them to have the choice.
Hmm. Right.
Okay. And so I'm always using language around permission and
Okay.
asking and giving voice and choice. And so then
Hmm.
instead of me calling out shame directly,
Hmm.
I may just ask them, "What are you noticing in your body right now?"
Hmm.
And then most of the time, I'm allowing them to articulate it.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm feeling some shame right now. And then and
Okay.
then we kind
Okay.
of work with it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that seems like you said, shame is the one thing that to notice it is to bring more shame. I mean, for people who
Hmm.
live in states of shame. Also, I'm curious about the timeliness. Like, there seems to be something about when something is heightened is the time to,
Hmm.
from a bodily rewiring approach, that there's a timeliness to when you're noticing it. This is the time to
Yeah.
deal with it. Not when you noticed it 5 days ago and now you're here being curious about it.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, and so my underlying Gestalt kind of theoretical perspective and framework, Gestalt is all about the here and now. And
Hmm.
so what you are referencing here is what's happening also neurologically here is that those old neural pathways are lighting up,
Hmm.
and that's when you want to work with them
Yes.
because there's where you can build a new experience. And so we're not changing history. Like we can't erase an event happening, but we can certainly build new neural pathways that allow the experience of the event to shift and change to where we're doing the integration in the brain. Because oftentimes what trauma is, we're having symptoms in the present that were activated in the past.
Mm.
And so the integration work is sort of like kind of integrating that and putting the memory and the feeling in the past. And I don't have to experience that now in the present.
Hmm. Okay. Wow. All right. Let's shift a little bit here to. I think one piece of being trauma informed is that we can begin to understand how our offering of spiritual practices to folks can be
Hmm.
helpful and it can be harmful or
Hmm.
re-traumatizing. I'd
Hmm.
love to hear you talk about spiritual practices that you have found most helpful for people wrestling with trauma, why those practices, and why not some of the practices that we often, our go-to practices. We're so excited to share, for example, silence and solitude with somebody.
Hmm.
Okay, is
Hmm.
that a helpful practice when we're working with someone in this space? So,
Yeah, and yeah, it's an excellent question. And what what I would say around that, it's not one practice is better than the other, or this practice is more harmful than something else, or
right, right,
or
right,
something like that, because it all depends on how the trauma unfolded and what was paired in with it within the brain, right? And so any practice can get paired in with trauma,
right, right,
right? And so, if I'm being sexually abused by the pastor, behind the stage when worship is going on, then I can get paired in, and worship music is now a trigger for me. And so if I wasn't allowed to speak or I was muzzled, and I didn't have a voice, then silence and solitude would not be there for me. But
Mm,
even those who have um, endured like ritualistic kinds of abuse and trauma, so liturgy is a form of ritual, and then that can get paired in as
mhm,
well.
mhm,
And so any kind of practice can be harmful depending upon if it got paired in, or it could be helpful in terms of healing.
mhm,
Yeah, because I've
mhm,
actually, incorporate some like faith imagination in terms of healing, but that could also be harmful for people,
mhm,
and also incorporate liturgy. So I do like personalized healing liturgies with folks too.
mhm. So you're not saying to avoid something, perhaps, but to be informed about what the potential harm could be, and then perhaps, still lovingly, slowly, perhaps consider how this could be part of a healing over time.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And so here's where we look through the trauma-informed lens, where
Hmm.
we are exploring
Hmm.
and asking directees, sort of inviting them to practices and giving them the choice around it.
Hmm.
And
Always, yeah.
so, yeah, yeah. And so then you're discerning, their response and if that's going to be helpful or if they have a reaction to that or,
Hmm.
yeah. Yeah,
Hmm.
so I'm wondering in your practices, what do you do? Like in your practices, like do you do silence or
Yeah.
solitude or
Hmm.
Lectio Divina or any of those kinds of practices, and then have them articulate what they do, and then they may even articulate, well, I can't do that XYZ practice because this is what's
Hmm.
happened.
I mean, the thing that's coming in my mind right now as you're saying that is the beauty of being a good listening presence and a curious
Hmm.
presence and relational presence in this space is we're listening and giving agency, allowing a directee to to have the agency to speak into this, right? And such a different approach than perhaps maybe some of the experiences we've had in church, where there's a one size fits all
Hmm.
approach to our discipleship and our healing, and
Hmm.
um, and it just reinforces in me the beauty, I think, of this spiritual direction space.
Hmm.
We're good. We're trying to be good listeners. We could go on and on. This is your space of expertise, and I want to save some stuff for people to actually engage with your ministry. So we don't want to lay all the cards out here necessarily. We want people to be able to engage with your ministry as a result of listening to this. I would I would like to though turn back to the church and even all the way back to your initial, how is it with your soul, right? And some of the
Hmm.
tension there. Man, what does a trauma informed church community look like now? And what can pastors, what can leaders do to actually prepare themselves and to hold space for those who are hurting?
Hmm. Yeah, I think getting educated about trauma certainly is the first step. And I think, you know, as we're trained as clinicians or spiritual directors, that whole way of holding presence and being a listening, embodied listener
Mhm.
is so important. But also kind of recognizing that when um, you know, I work with a lot of people who've been spiritually abused, and there's a lot that gets paired in, as we talked about with trauma with that. And so, authority then means, if they hear words like authority can be a trigger for them because then it meant that they were controlled or manipulated,
Mhm.
or even reading scripture can be a trigger because then it was used as a weapon to control or shame those. And then not giving agency
Mhm.
around things. And so then what happens for folks when they go into a church setting instead of the sanctuary, it's more of a minefield.
Mm-hmm.
It's this minefield of triggers of like what's happening in the worship and what got paired in and can I trust people? Can I trust this pastor? Can I trust this authority? Because even some of the titles of pastor or the word authority or submission or obedience or even sin can then be triggers. And so if we're triggered in a trauma state, then we're not receptive.
Mm-hmm.
We're not receptive for change, and we're not receptive to make decisions. And so then we can get reinforced in our trauma neural pathways in those settings. So I think if church leaders are informed about how does trauma impact someone, how does spiritual trauma impact someone, is there ways that we can sit with how we do church to be more
Mm-hmm.
sensitive to those who have been traumatized?
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of, more modern sanctuaries are about dimming the lights and just having a light up on front. And that can be very terrifying for some people being in the dark. Um, or what kinds of music are we actually playing in terms of how's the worship leader leading it? And so, is there voice and choice around that? So, you have some worship leaders that are like, okay, I want everyone to stand up and raise your hands. Well, you're not going to tell me what to do because that's what my perpetrator did, right? Or even someone leading in communion is, okay, and they use language like, I want you to close your eyes. Inviting someone to close their eyes if they have trauma where it wasn't safe to not be seeing what's happening around you can be a trigger as well. And so we want to be just cautious around those things and having even ways of how do we filter the way that we do theology through more of a trauma lens. And I get a lot of that, especially around women who've been abused and how certain faith circles see women, especially women in authority or leadership or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we look through a trauma-informed lens as we look at particular kinds of theological perspectives on things?
Mm-hmm. I also think part of being trauma informed would also enable a pastor, a leader to receive the the person who comes to them to say something about that wasn't right for me, right? Because I
Hmm.
think we can be very dismissive. We can say, well, I can't please everybody all the time. I mean, this kind of thing.
Hmm.
And I just because you feel this, right? And we can be very dismissive and say, well, that's that person's problem, right?
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I just
Yeah.
wonder if part of the beauty of thinking more trauma informed is that it enables us to be people of love when
Hmm.
we realize what's what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I think you hit a pretty frequent one where people have gone to church authority or pastors or elders and have reported, hey, this is an issue for me.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't see it through a trauma lens, or they're seeing that this person is just a problem or
Mm-hmm.
complaining. One incident that I had is I was at a particular church and they have near the coffee a bookshelf where they have particular books on there. And I was familiar with this one author who I have felt in a lot of his writings, and he writes on parenting, is that a lot of his suggestions, I think, are toxic or harmful or even abusive, and how he looks at children and then just developmentally where they are in their brains, that they're not going to be able to do what he's saying that they should be doing. And so I made this comment to the pastor. I'm like, oh, does the church support this guy in his books? And then he just kind of laughed it off, but the book is still sitting on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't make me feel safe if they're supporting someone who in their writings is promoting what could be harmful to children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So th- there, you might have felt dismissed, right?
Hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And not only
Yeah.
dismissed, especially if I'm coming from a trauma perspective,
Mm-hmm.
but it's more than dismissiveness. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's reinforcing of those trauma neural pathways.
Okay. Okay.
And it is a sense that it is not safe here, and these people are not safe. Because
Mm-hmm.
if this is the kind of sort of philosophy or teaching or training that's being supported, then how can I be here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. I think we could use some encouragement right now, Dr. Dave. I would love to hear just some words of encouragement, maybe an invitation that you could offer someone who is feeling stuck in some trauma, stuck in some pain, spiritual pain, embodied pain, feeling wounded by God or by the church,
Yeah.
afraid to hope again, like what would you like to say?
Yeah. No, thank you for that because it does feel heavy, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Even just speaking about it. And it is a heavy topic. But I would say to those who are really struggling with this is that you are not alone. And even though it may feel like that you are, you're not. There's other people out there that are wrestling with similar things, and there's other people out there that really get it and understand it. And this may take some time to kind of find those people. Um, but I do think that and ultimately, I don't think I know that there is a path to healing. It's not going to be an easy path. It's a journey.
Mm,
Um, but I do see it is that it takes us the depths of ourselves and it can open us up to an experience of God like we never dreamt of.
mm,
If we're able to kind of endure the journey.
mm.
And I think it's here where it's very helpful to have a really healthy sense of a theology of suffering.
Okay.
And we don't really get a lot of that healthy teaching in the church often. But I kind of look at suffering, if we can think about suffering as a sort of female spiritual companion.
Mm,
And because if we look at the etymology of the word of suffering, it has this connotation of giving birth.
mm,
And we look at, can suffering be this female spiritual companion for me in this time where it's holding me until I can find the depths of myself
mm, mm,
and holding me until I can have this depth of an experience with God
mm,
in this deep inner healing way. And here's where I find that the Holy Spirit just really does a lot of transformational work as we can rest into our suffering
mm, mm,
and embrace it as a way of part of the process and what God does to transform through that. And so I sit with a lot of people in a lot of dark spaces and a lot of trauma. And in some of my work, I do these intensive inner healing um, uh, process work with groups of folks
mm,
on a retreat. We do this deep inner healing experiential work, and I see God show up, and
mm.
it's incredible. I mean, I'm so honored to have a front row seat to that kind of healing work and watching God tangibly like free people. That's one of the best parts of my job.
Mhm, mhm.
And
Uh,
so there is hope. Yeah.
yeah, there's hope. Tell us more about what people can glean from Simda Soul Care. What kind of things are you offering?
Yeah, I mean, so I do offer one-on-one, but the group intensives,
Mm,
because it's in community
mm,
and are just an incredible experience. So I frequently offer intensive inner healing retreats around that. And because of my specialties in trauma, but I'm also a sort of a sex therapist, I do a lot with areas of sexual healing, sexual abuse, sex addiction, betrayal trauma. And so I may have some specific retreats for guys who are wrestling with sexual addiction or for women who are struggling with betrayal trauma
mm,
around that. I
mm,
do some general inner healing retreats for anybody who wants to come and experience the Symptom Soul Care healing model.
mhm,
Um, I also at times hold what I call the ecclesial healing gatherings.
mm,
And so what I did last year, the 4 weeks leading up to Advent, I took each of those 4 weeks, and you know how we light the Advent candle and those aspects of joy, peace, love,
Hmm.
and integrated it with Jesus's arrival, with Jesus's healing. And what
Hmm.
does it mean in those 4 weeks in experiencing healing in those particular areas?
Hmm.
And so that was part of my ecclesial healing gathering. And then because I've had so many people been wounded by the church, I held a 6 week course around healing from spiritual abuse
Okay.
and trauma.
All right.
And so yeah, and then I do some teaching and training about being trauma informed,
Yeah.
and I'm looking at launching a spiritual direction program actually.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
going to be a trauma informed spiritual direction program with this holistic healing aspect
Hmm.
to it,
Hmm.
and so it kind of help broaden um, sort of the tools or the abilities and the presence of being able to bring people to more of this healing depth
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
And I noticed on your website that's already up, and it's not just for people who have not yet been trained as spiritual directors. It also could be for folks who have gone through some kind of a training, are already doing it. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So when I first launched it, I was looking up, how can I in my ministry help to train up other people to help heal people or
Hmm.
be a part of God's healing in their life, and without needing to kind of go through all this schooling to become a therapist and a licensure and all of that. Because I think some people, through their own process and healing work or just their giftedness, they just need some help and supervision and some training, and they can bring people to depths of healing, just as well as anybody else. Um, and so I started off as a spiritual direction to your program, but I'm now reshaping it to
Okay.
where I'm breaking it into modules. Whereas I have some therapists who may have the trauma part, but they don't have the spiritual formation
Okay.
integration piece.
Okay.
So it's sort of like a menu or buffet where you can choose the modules you want. But if you wanted to become a spiritual director and with the trauma informed
Uh-huh.
and the holistic healing components, you can take the whole thing.
Yeah.
So, so
Awesome.
I'm still in, yeah, so I'm still in the process of that. And I have some folks, like yourself, you're already a spiritual director, so you don't need that. But there may be components like the neuroscience or the trauma pieces that could enhance your integration work.
I like it. Thank you. Dr. Dave, what a joy. What a blessing to have you with us today. Oh, man, I really appreciate your hospitality of heart, your generosity, your willingness to share from the depths of wisdom and from experience. It's a joy to get to know you, to be with you, for other people to get to hear your heart, and to be really walking alongside you in this wonderful ministry of soul care. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Adam. It was a blessing and a joy. I appreciate it.
All right. God bless you.
Thank you. You too.
Well, Dr. Dave, thank you. I'm really grateful for your wisdom and for the compassionate work you're doing with people who are longing for healing. Friends, if this conversation resonates with you, I want to encourage you, take a moment, simply notice what stirred in you as you listened. Conversations about trauma and healing can touch deep places in the soul. Sometimes the most faithful response is simply to slow down, to hold these places gently before God, even have a sense of God holding you. If you'd like to learn more about Dave's work, you can find links in the show notes to SIMDA Soul Care. As always, thank you for listening to the Being Formed podcast. It's a gift to share these conversations with you as we continue the slow and beautiful work of being formed in Christ. So keep walking the path. God is with you. You are being formed. Until next time, grace and peace.